Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen. How are you, Helen?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm absolutely splendid. Thank you very much.
Great. I'm really looking forward to our topic today. What's our topic?
Yes, we're on to the next topic, aren't we, in our
Yes.
cycle of different coaching explorations. So the topic that we are... Now, it's not really a topic that people come to the coaching room saying, I'd like to talk about this, please. But it is something that shows up in different ways. So what we're going to be talking about is introversion. And I don't think I've ever had anyone come to the coaching room saying, I'm an introvert, please coach me. But it does show up in lots of different guises. And obviously, if you were coaching someone around their personality profile, if you're doing some personality coaching, definitely introversion would be an element of that. So,
Yeah, I've certainly had people that have brought things to the coaching room where they think they should be a certain way.
yes.
And they are not that way because they're introverted. So they've had to find a new way to be. So for you, how do you think introversion shows up in the coaching room?
I think it's a really good question. I think what I want to do before I answer that is just to clarify what we're talking about when we talk about introversion.
Good idea.
So if we reflect on the subject of personality psychology, one of the dimensions that tends to be part of any psychological model or personality model is extroversion and introversion. So they tend to be combined. So if we go back to Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychologist, eminent Swiss psychologist in the last century, he was the one that introduced the idea of introversion and extroversion as an attitude within someone's personality. And if we don't care for Carl Jung particularly, I mean, it was his idea about personality, so it's just one man's thoughts, so we don't have to take his word for it. But since Carl Jung, there have been numerous researchers that have looked at traits. Carl Jung used to look at types, what type of personality someone had. So type theory is a thing within personality psychology. Other researchers looked at traits. So there are a couple of researchers, Goldberg is one of them, Costa and McRae, another couple of researchers, who have variations on the big 5 personality factors, so personality traits, and extroversion sits in there as a trait. So someone low on the extroversion scale would be an introvert. They don't actually refer to introverts, they refer to extroversion and whether you're high, low extroversion. But it's the same thing.
Okay, so Jung had like a sliding scale with extroversion at one end, introversion at the other, and then...
Yeah, I don't think Jung had scales. I think he just had this concept that people were either one or the other.
Okay.
You either have that inward focus or you have an outward focus. That's extroversion and introversion. Other people decided they wanted to measure that. So the whole idea of personality psychometrics is you get a measure of the degree of someone's extroversion or introversion. So obviously from Carl Jung's work, Myers and Briggs, 2 women in America, took his ideas and turned it into a psychometric where your introversion, extroversion was measured. And the same with traits that tend to be psychometrics around the traits. So you would be measured high, low extroversion. So that's where introversion comes in.
So we're fairly sure this is a thing.
Yes,
Introversion
it
and
does
extroversion
exist, yeah.
exists as a concept. What are we talking about when we talk about introversion?
Well, I think it's a really broad label to start with. So whilst you might ask people questions on a psychometric, you ask a number of questions around different aspects of being an introvert. But it's really, I guess, how someone appears to other people. They might be seen as quiet and reserved. They might be seen as reflective and thoughtful, perhaps calm and considered, private and contained. Those sorts of words tend to get used as descriptors for someone who has that introversion tendency. Some people might just think they're rude,
Ignoring
they
you.
don't say a lot. So that tends to be the way that introverts are seen. How they feel inside might be a different thing, but that's how they tend to be perceived. So that obviously those phrases that I've used, those labels, don't capture introversion perfectly, but give us some idea of what we're talking about when we start to explore introversion. So in personality terms, there's one concept, and Jung's concept was really around where you get your energy from. So people with an extroversion preference tend to focus their energy outwards towards activities, other people. People with an introversion preference tend to focus inward and into their internal world and focus on their inner thoughts.
Yes, because I've heard it described as how we recharge.
Yes, yeah.
So, which
That's
I can
definitely. If you take Myers-Briggs as an example, the MBTI instrument, that's how they would view it. That it's how you recharge your batteries, which seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Other people have other ideas. So there is some work. There was a German psychologist called Eysenck, again last century, but he had the idea that there were physiological differences in people's brains, and it was about the amount of stimulation that people wanted. So people who had an introversion preference were overstimulated already, so they really didn't want any more stimulation, so they liked quiet environments. And people with an extroversion preference were understimulated, so they went seeking additional stimulation, so looking outwards for that stimulation.
Okay.
Which sort of makes sense as well.
Yeah, it does. But is there any neuroscience to back that up?
I think it's coming. I don't think there's any definitive. I mean, he was working in a time when that neuroscience really wasn't available.
No.
So, and I think his theories are quite controversial. But I think there is now neuroscience coming through that suggests that there is some difference. And that the latest thing that I've seen is around the dopamine activation system, and that extroverts tend to that reward system, so that pursuit of rewards that we all have, because that's how we find food and survive as a species, that's more highly activated in extroverts than it is in introverts. That introverts don't tend to seek reward in the same way. So that's new research that's coming out around the dopamine reward system, and there seems to be some connection with introversion and extroversion.
Interesting. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
But at the moment, there's no definitive.
No.
This is what makes an introvert. This is what makes an extrovert. No. And I know for me that it depends on the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We both have an extroversion preference. Whenever we do psychometrics, we always come out as extroverts. But we both have times where we just need to be quiet. I can't work in a busy environment. And I think for a long time I kidded myself that I could. And so when I was studying for my psychology degree, I'd sit down on a Saturday morning to do some study. By 11 o'clock, I'd be in a coffee shop being around people because it was really dull being on my own. But actually being around people, I couldn't work because I was distracted by everything. I was be listening to other people's conversations rather than getting on with my work. So it's not that if you're an extrovert, you're always going to want to be around people and that's a good environment for you. It's just you tend to want that. You'll go out seeking it.
Okay, so how does this help us in the coaching room?
Well, I think if we start off thinking about the coach and the activity of coaching, let's start there, because I think coaching is really quite an introverted activity.
Yes.
Okay, we're talking to someone else, so our focus is outwards towards them, but it's just one individual, and it tends to be quite a low-key conversation, so there's lots of time and space within the conversation that perhaps an extrovert wouldn't engage with. So I think it requires us to spend the majority of our time just reflecting and thoughtful, which is not an extroverted activity.
No.
So we want to leave space. We want to not rush in and give our opinion, which tends to be what extroverts do. They go, "Oh, I know the answer to this." So all of the activities that we talked about in terms of introverted activities, so that being quiet and reflective and thinking about things before we speak, that sort of thing, is what we would do in the coaching room. So I think if you are an introvert and you come to coaching, you have a bit of a head start because you're naturally going to do what's required in the coaching room. If you're an extrovert and you come to coaching, you've got to flex, you've got to be different.
So if anyone's looking at our coaching course and they're thinking, I'm an introvert, can I do this? The answer is probably, absolutely, and probably easier than an extrovert.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I see that on the course, that someone coming we don't test them, see whether they're introverts or extroverts, but by their manner whether they have that tendency, but they tend to be better initially in the coaching. I think it's a learned thing. So I think if anyone watches me coach, if you go back and listen to our podcast episode where we do a coaching demonstration, I am definitely behaving in a way that you would expect an introvert to behave,
yes,
not an extrovert. So I'm very reserved and leave lots of time and space. So that, I think, is really important to recognise in the coaching room, that it is an introverted activity.
But not all coaches have to be introverts. No. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it.
No. But I don't think I could coach full time every day, all day. I think that would be a struggle.
I think we both need to do training and things that help us develop or work with our extroversion tendencies.
Yeah, so I think we're both in our element when we're running a training workshop where we're interacting with lots of people, and that's almost us at our best. And thinking about it, we went to a medical conference back in September, and we were in our element because people were coming up to talk to us, and we were just having those conversations with people that we were buzzing.
Yes.
3 days at a conference talking to people was our ideal. But that doesn't mean to say that I love my coaching, and I wouldn't want to not do coaching. So it's a flex for me to engage in a coaching activity, but it's something I'm perfectly capable of doing.
So introversion, extroversion, both can be coaches and both can be coached.
Yes.
So that's good to know that we're not in the wrong space then.
Yes.
And it sounds as though introverts are definitely in the right space. So that's looking at things from the coach's perspective. But let's say we have a coachee who is an introvert. How might that work?
Well, in my experience, coaches who are introverted tend to be more reflective before they answer. So they will just sit there and think about a question before they come back with an answer. Now, if they have an extroverted coach who hasn't learned how to coach properly, who isn't aware of this introversion tendency, they might panic a bit when they're not getting an answer straight away. And they might think, oh, God, I've asked the wrong question. I better ask them another one quick. So they ask another question. And then the coachee has 2 questions to think about before they answer. And so they'll take even more time. And then the coachee might start to think, oh, God, they're really struggling with this. I'll ask that question in a different way so that they'll understand it better. And so they ask a different version of the same question, which gives the introverted coachee another dilemma because they've now got 3 questions. And they're just sitting there thinking, why doesn't he just shut up and let me think about the question? Because that's what I need to do. So I was coaching a surgeon, it was probably 18 months ago now, who was clearly very introverted. He was, I would ask him a question and he would just sit. And I can still picture him now. He would just sit and he would just look down to his right-hand side, to the floor. That was his thinking space. And he would just do that. And it might be for about 20 seconds, which is quite a long time for someone just to be looking away, thinking. But he would just think to the end of his thoughts, and then he would look back at me just to let me know he'd stopped thinking. And then we would move the conversation on. And he might reflect back what he was thinking. But if I'd have rushed in and gone, oh God, where's he gone? He's not answering my question. I'd have denied him that opportunity to do that really good reflective thinking that people with introversion preference tend to want to do.
I definitely noticed, I always used to seem to coach extroverts, and I noticed during lockdown I got a lot of new clients who were introverts, and I remember being quite not surprised, but I wasn't quite sure how to handle that. And I think we spoke about it, and you simply said, they're an introvert, let them think. And each of those introverts had their own thinking process. And once I realised what their thinking process was, because the first time it happened to me, I thought the screen had frozen.
Yes, and I think that is a problem online, is that if someone is just reflective and just sitting there thinking,
yes.
We can go, oh, has it frozen? Is that me? Is that...
This person just sits still, absolutely frozen, and blinks really slowly as well. And so I was saying, oh, I think the screen's frozen. And she was like, oh, no, I don't think it has. But obviously I'd interrupted her thinking then, so she had to think again. So it was a really interesting coaching development point for me to start to work with introverts.
Yeah, and allowing them to be their own person and
Yes.
not rushing through coaching in the way that we want to coach, and just do the same to everyone. It's recognising that they come with a different way of being.
Because we, as extroverts, often think out loud through talking.
Yes. Yeah. So if someone's coaching me, I don't really stop talking. They'll ask me a question and I'll talk for 10 minutes, and then they'll ask me another question, I'll talk for another 10 minutes, and that's it, job done. But that's not going to happen generally with someone who is more introverted.
So it sounds as though that lovely space that we try to create in the coaching room is really useful for introverts. So if we are coaching someone who we think is an introvert, what particular problems might they come to coaching with, do you think?
Well, I think just like everyone else, they're going to come to coaching with a range of desired outcomes. Tends not to be something specific to introverts, but I think there are some topics that do tend to show up. So quite often I find they'll be struggling to get their voice heard, or will feel that they're struggling to get their voice heard,
Yes.
especially within an organisation, and maybe a hospital setting or a GP practice, or in a committee meeting. Almost any environment where there's a lot of people involved, introverts may well leave a meeting saying, damn, I really wanted to say something and haven't said it. I think that's quite often what happens. And certainly the surgeon that I was coaching, he would have meetings, department meetings, and he'd say, I don't say what I want to say in those meetings. And what he described was a very extroverted community, that the extroverts just spoke and they moved on. The conversation moved on very quickly and they talked over one another, which is sort of an extroverted practice. They don't care. They'll just cut in across each other. But
Sounds like my family.
Yeah. But for introverts, that's really difficult. They really don't want life to be like that. So they'll just withdraw, they'll withhold what they were going to say because they don't want to be spoken over. They don't want to have that cut and thrust of conversation. So I think this is a problem maybe that could be solved by the person in charge. So if you had someone who was a department head who was running meetings and recognised that there were both introverts and extroverts in the room, they would facilitate those meetings better and it wouldn't just be a free-for-all. So I think they're always going to get the answers from extroverts, and extroverts tend to get their way because they will speak up. But actually giving time and space for introverts to have their say can be really helpful. So there's a coaching model actually that comes from Nancy Klein, which is called the thinking environment, where people are given time and space. So in a meeting you would, and I'm going to do this in a week's time. I've got a culture session to do with a group of people, and there will be a mix of extroverts. You know, it's roughly 50-50 in the population, 50% extroverts, 50% introverts. So you will have that range of people within that organisation. And if we get, I think there's 19 people, if we get them around a table and ask them their opinions, the extroverts are going to speak up. So what I will do is use this thinking environment where everyone will get 3 minutes. They will just have 3 minutes to think and to talk, and no one can interrupt. So it's not that cut and thrust. Oh no, that's wrong. You don't think about it like that. They just get their 3 minutes, and then we move on to someone else. Which, I think if you've got that understanding in an organisation of how your team is, that can be really helpful. But that's something perhaps for introverts to think about, that if they are struggling in a meeting to have their voice heard, what strategies they could have to change the way the meetings. Sometimes they will be chairing the meeting. So they have a perfect opportunity to say, okay, we're going to run this meeting like this. Everyone is going to get 3 minutes. That could be a thing. So I think it's just them thinking about how they're going to navigate their space to their advantage.
One thing I've noticed through some of my introverted clients is that I do a lot of work around confidence with women, and there is a societal expectation of what confidence looks like. And when you have an introvert who sees that and doesn't see themselves in that, then there's this conflict because they think, I'm not confident. Yeah. So one of the things I've been working with one particular client is around reframing that idea of what is confidence, and is it okay to have a different type of confidence than what most people expect confidence to look like? So that's quite an interesting topic.
Yes, and I think it's perfectly possible to be in a meeting feeling very confident about the meeting, but to want to think about what's coming up. So say extroverts will just blurt out whatever's in their head.
Yeah.
They might leave meetings going, oh God, why did I say that?
I've never done that.
But introverts will sit and they'll ponder. They'll go, oh, this is interesting. I need to give this some thought. So again, one of the ways they might navigate that so that they do appear confident is to perhaps think about it ahead of time, so they come ready prepared to say something. They might still struggle to get their voice heard above the extroverts, but there are ways to navigate this and strategies that they can use to demonstrate their confidence, because it's not about social anxiety. Although it's not about social anxiety, that's a good point, but it can be. So we talked earlier about the big five, the personality factors. So introversion, extroversion is one, but there's also emotional stability. So if you have someone who is low on emotional stability, so they get very anxious about things, it might be that in that environment of a meeting, an introvert might be an anxious introvert. So they might not be confident. So we can't just work, okay, well, it's okay, you're confident, you're just an introvert, because it might be that they're not.
Yes.
So I think it's just that interplay of those different personality factors will come into play with how someone shows up.
It sounds like we might need to do an episode on trait theory.
Yes. Yeah, and it's fascinating stuff. But I think when we talk about introverts, there will be different kinds of introverts.
Yes. So the way that different personality traits interact with that introversion preference.
Yeah. So there's another Jungian type theory called insights, where they only look at two of the dimensions. I mean, they vaguely bring in a third one, but they just focus on that introversion, extroversion thing and thinking and feeling. So they see people with an introverted preference and a thinking preference as analytical. Just leave me alone, let me analyse that. People with an introverted feeling preference as show me you care. I have that emotional side to me. I want to know that you care. I'm not going to tell you that that's what I want from you, but that's what I want. So that introverted, earth green, they call that. They call the other one, the introverted thinking, cool blue.
Oh.
So again, different ways that introverts might demonstrate their introverted tendencies. So one of the other ways that, one of the other aspects of someone's life that might come into play, we've talked about meetings and things like that, but just the working space, the environment that they find themselves in. So if you imagine that maybe someone has gone into medicine because what they've done really well up to that point is studied hard in a very introverted way. So they've got on with their books and they've settled down to do their study. They've got to university. They've done well at university, but suddenly find themselves in a busy A&E department. That's not really an environment that an introvert is going to welcome, really, because it's busy, it's chaotic, there's lots of noise going on. So it's not really how you might want to be as an introvert. So I think for introverts to recognise what's a goodness of fit for them as an environment. I say these aren't absolutes, and you could well have an introvert that turns up to A&E and thrives in that space. But generally speaking, introverts are going to prefer quieter environments where they can think and take their time. And if they find themselves in that environment, it might not be the best place for them. And they might just crack on with it because that's their job and that's what they're trained to do. And, okay, I need to do this. But I think it's useful for them to think about who they are and what environment is going to suit them. And if they've never thought about whether they're an introvert or not, they might just go, well, I'm a doctor, so I have to get on with this environment.
So that sounds like they might come to coaching quite exhausted.
Yeah, because it is tiring. So if you have to flex out of your natural tendency we can all do it, but we can't do it forever. So if you are an introvert and you're in a very busy environment and a very noisy environment and having to cope with lots of extroverts, that is going to be exhausting. Now, I'm not saying that's a reason for people burning out, but it's not going to add to their resilience if they are constantly in an environment that isn't a good fit for them. So one of the strategies that they might have if they are in a busy environment that doesn't suit them is, if we think about that idea of replenishing your energy at the end of a shift in a busy environment, they might go home and have a bath and read a book and find some quiet space where they can recharge. And that might be enough. That might be all they need.
I can imagine there's some A&E doctors thinking, that would be amazing, please. I'd like to have the time to go and rest and recharge between shifts.
But I think it is useful to think about it. But in the long term, obviously, if you have someone with an introversion preference, finding a role that suits their personality is going to be helpful. And I think actually, a bit like coaching, a GP role is quite a good space for introverts. So you're having one-to-one conversations with people. Okay, you're seeing people all day, but they're one-to-one conversations. They're not hectic. So you can take your time. You've got your own room, so you're not really being disturbed by other people's noise. So you can have that, and you've got a little bit of space in between. Well, hopefully a little bit of space in between people coming in and out. So there is more time and space for you to reflect. So I think that could be good. And if you think about some GPs now work online. So again, quite an easy space for an introvert to be. They perhaps don't necessarily need to go out and engage with people face to face. They'd be quite happy to sit online. Whereas I think if you're an extrovert working online, you'd get a bit itchy to get out and see people, more so than introverts would. I had a client that during lockdown, he worked for an organisation where they had to be in the office. There was no scope to work from home or anything like that. And during lockdown, they all had to go home. So he went home and he thrived because he was off the scale introverted and just loved it. And it was a real struggle to get him back into work. And now he does a mix of some days at home and some in the office. But for him, being at home allows him that time and space to really think and to do his best work. Coming into the office, that noisier environment, it's not helpful for him.
It's interesting, isn't it, that time that was so difficult for so many people and so challenging, certainly for medical experts, also must have allowed some people that reflection on what works best for them. Something positive perhaps come out, of that situation in particular where he's recognised this is a better way for me to work. Yeah,
so if you've had that, if you're a GP and you've suddenly found online work is a possibility, it might be that that's a space you love and you want to do more of that. So it allows you that reflection of, okay, well, actually, that seems like a really good space for me. I'll do more of that stuff. I don't really want to go in and be in a practice where I've got to engage with other people. It's interesting, isn't it?
And all really great coaching territory.
Yeah. So one other thing that I think sometimes comes into the coaching room with introverts is that they tend to prefer to communicate in writing. So they'd probably prefer to send an email than pick the phone up. Now, I think the world has moved. When all of this theory was instigated, the internet didn't exist. So everyone either picked up the phone or they sent a letter. Or that was the way you communicated. Now everyone communicates in writing. So whilst that's an introverted tendency, we all do it now. And we all do it a lot. So I think the world has moved in the direction of introverts from that respect. But I think it's useful to recognise that that's how introverts generally would rather be.
Yeah.
And if someone, why don't they ever pick? So I've had this recently with my estate agent, who never picks the phone up. It would be far more efficient for her to just ring me and go, Tom, what do you think of this? But she'll send an email. And I find, because I'm an extrovert, I find it slightly frustrating that she's not just picking the phone up and having a chat with me. There's like this to and fro of emails. But that is a more introverted way to communicate.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because often people put that down to whether you're a millennial or, a generational difference. But it seems that might be the case. But there's also this introversion, extroversion difference
I'd say
as
the
well.
world has moved in the direction of introverts because we all communicate in writing a lot more. And in some ways it is efficient, but when you're working with people in a people context, you want to have a chat with someone, you want to explore things with people. So actually picking the phone up and having that conversation could be better.
Yes, especially where timeliness
Yeah.
is important. So earlier we spoke a bit about confidence and particularly workplace scenarios. There is a bit of an idea that extroverts want to socialise and introverts don't, and it's not as clear cut as that, is it?
No, and I think, again, that's something that I find comes into the coaching room, where someone has to socialise from a work perspective, so they have to show up and be sociable, but perhaps have that when they arrive at a venue, they don't want to go in because they're going to have to talk to people and they might not know people. So again, I think that's about finding strategies to deal with that. So it might be that you arrive with a friend and have someone to walk in with and someone to talk to straight away, so you're not having to engage with everybody. It might be that they just corner one person and have a conversation with them for some time, then move on and corner another person, rather than trying to interact with a big group of people. Because I think, again, that can be quite difficult for introverts, especially, and I have a bit of this in social settings. I do quite like people to take their turn in talking. I'm not very good when people just talk over one another. And I'm not an introvert, but I would imagine for introverts, if you are in, let's say you were sat in a pub talking to people and everyone's just talking over one another, that could be really annoying for introverts, or really, really frustrating. And say that what tends to happen is people just go quiet and they don't speak.
So as a coach working with an introverted client, it's about helping them to find their coping strategies, about how they can make that situation less uncomfortable for them and it actually maybe even enjoy it.
Yeah. So I think with all of this, it is just how you support an introvert. Well, so I think first thing is having some vocabulary around this. So rather than someone saying, oh yeah, well, I'm a bit shy and I don't like being around people, it's okay, well, you're not shy, you're just an introvert, could be really helpful. And if you sort of explain that half the population are introverts, so it's not that they're on their own with this. So I think that could be really helpful. I think in terms of strategies, then to work with the client about how they might navigate the space that they're in. I think also in terms of that goodness of a fit of the environment they're in. So they might really enjoy the work that they're doing, but just not enjoy the environment because it's a busy environment. So thinking, how could I do this in a different way that is going to allow me to feel resourced and have some energy and not feel exhausted by having to be around people all the time. So I think it's really useful for people to just stop and think about, when we talked on the Gestalt module, we talked about people becoming more who they are.
I was just thinking about that, yeah.
Yeah, so if people can recognise, well, I'm an introvert, why am I trying to be extroverted all the time? Why am I trying to bend to what other people want me to be? I want to be who I am and be more me.
Yes. So having an understanding that that's okay to do that, and then how you go about doing that.
Yeah. I think one recommendation I have, there's a lady called Susan Cain who wrote a book called Quiet, and it's about her experience of being an introvert in a very extroverted world. And she talks about the bias that the world has towards extroverts because they tend to move on quicker because they're vocal about what they want. But she's also got a TED Talk, which is about the power of introverts, and I think that's useful. If you are an introvert, it's useful to watch someone talk about it in a way that makes sense. So I'd recommend that as a TED Talk at least.
Perhaps we'll put a link to the show.
Yeah, that'd be
in the
good.
show notes.
Yeah.
Excellent. This has been really interesting.
Excellent. I think it is worth perhaps doing a future podcast on the big 5 personality traits and how that all interplays within the coaching room.
Lovely. Thank you so much for our interesting topic today.
Yeah, thank you, Helen.
Next time we're going to be interviewing another coaching doctor.
We are. We look forward to that. We always enjoy our interviews, don't we?
Yeah.
It's always interesting to see how people, quite often these doctors have been on our transformational coaching diploma, and so it's always interesting to see how they're implementing their coaching, where they're using it, in what context. So that'd be fascinating to have that conversation.
Excellent.
So thank you very much, Helen.
In the meantime, subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode. And of course, if you've enjoyed it, leave us a review. That would be great.
Wonderful. We'll see you next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.